by validating the information from the credential. And so here's how this could work. So, I'll take somebody who in the paper we named Stacy, which may or may not be my wife's name, and she wants to open something up at a bank. And she gives a bunch of information. The bank says, no idea who you are, but how do we find that out? So here, she basically would say, well, I want the government to help me prove on me. I'm going to make a request that the Social Security Administration validate the information that I just gave you to prove that I'm a real person. So once that consent goes through, the bank can then basically set up a quick connection through an API to SSA, pass the information on, and get a match. You can do the same thing with the DMV. Again, I'm requesting the government helps me. Do a quick exchange of information, match or no match, yes or no answer. One of the things to point out here is we're not actually saying that agencies should be sharing information. We had a big debate among the companies when we were working on this. Some said, hey, wouldn't it be great if you go to the DMV and they could just tell us who you were? And then we looked at it more and said, if we do that, something's going to go wrong. There's just a lot of risks that are there. Nobody really knows how to secure everything. But if we're just getting to yes, no answers, validation, it's really not a security issue. There's not a privacy concern because the government's not revealing information about you. They're just saying whether something matches. So this model is actually something that the Social Security Administration is now in the process of building, thanks to Section 215 of the Big Bank Reg Reform Bill that passed last year, trying to get to this whole synthetic identity fraud issue. Remember when I talked before about the $6 billion in fraud because a fraudster steals my kid's SSN and then applies for credit? Well, just getting a simple yes-no answer when somebody's applying for the first time and they're seeing an identity, hey, does this name and SSN and date of birth really match? Oh, are they not dead? That's an extra good data point to know when it comes to fraud. Just getting that validation is going to make a serious dent in all of the fraud that we see. Now the second, but the only thing that does is solve synthetic identity fraud. It still doesn't allow people to prove that they are who they really are, because there's no, just because I'm providing information, I might have Tom's information be applying in his name, and because I stole his wallet at the break when we were getting quesadilla, I'm able to get that information. So I think the way you can take it up a little bit further is if you basically build off of those attribute validation services with some other things. So what we talked about here are there apps that can enable consumers to easily prove their identity. So again, we'll talk to Stacy. She's trying to go to the water department this time, just to make it out. And again, applies for something they're not sure who she is. And she said, I want the government to help me prove on me. But instead of just getting an exchange with an agency, say the DMV, she's going to open up a mobile driver's license app. We talked about this before. Wouldn't it be cool if we actually had this thing? And she'll log into it, say with FIDO authentication, which then unlocks a cryptographic key that the DMV now knows, okay, this is actually the device that we provisioned the mobile driver's license to on at the time of issuance. And we know her consent's being passed through. And so now you have a chain of trust between the person who you issued the credential to, the device that they're holding, the cryptographic key that's on it. And at that point, you can open up a secure channel between the two, share the information, and say if there's a match or no match. Oklahoma just announced that they're rolling this out next week. A lot of the work's actually based off some of the pilots we funded back when I was at NIST. And there's a new ISO standard in the works right now for these kinds of driver's licenses that I think you'll start to see take hold in other states and really around the globe. And so this is a way with the DMV doing nothing more than attribute validation plus binding a secure app to somebody's device gets you basically a chain of trust that you can use to really prove you are, not just a real person, but that particular real person.
So that's derived credentials, basically?
It's a different kind of derived credential. I would not say it's a derived credential in the way that NIST describes it today, but the idea is it's a way to have a digital version on your phone of a physical credential. So I'd say NIST has way too, the 800-157 is way too rigorous of a standard. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. Yeah.
More down to earth. Wouldn't the challenge with that be, though, that people are changing their phones out all the time?
Yeah, you got to have a way to transfer from one to another. It doesn't solve all problems. And you'll have lost phones, you'll have stolen phones that you got to recover. You're going to have a way to go back to the DMV, and just like you lose your driver's license too. I mean, anything you give somebody that's got security value, if they lose, now you got a what if issue. So again, there's no silver bullets, but these are things that can happen. And this isn't a totally new idea, the idea of agencies validating attributes. I mentioned that 2016 report from the commission that came out. They specifically talked about one of the recommendations, government should serve as a source to validate identity attributes to address online identity challenges. And I won't read all the stuff here, but this is not the first time this has been proposed. Privacy becomes a really big issue, and so one of the, we always get asked, well, what about privacy? So I have a slide, what about privacy? I think, our take here is if these things go forward, it's really important that you take a privacy by design approach to ensure any new solutions are architected from the start to address privacy risks and that you've got good protections that are embedded in the solution architecture. We think government should only be validating data if there's a specific consumer request. It shouldn't just be something that the banks can suddenly or anybody else can start going into government databases whenever they want and checking things. It's got to be tied to a particular transaction, a particular request, and only for the purpose specified. We think consumers should be able to choose to share or validate only certain attributes about themselves without revealing all of their identity data. There's a lot of things the DMV knows about me, including my driver's record, that might not be relevant to my bank, and it shouldn't be an all or nothing kind of approach. And one of the things that we pointed out in here as a recommendation was to ensure that we actually set a high bar for security and privacy. We think my old friends at NIST should be funded to lead development of a framework of standards and operating rules that will apply to any new government service that comes up here. That way you've got, well, basically a standard that ensures that there's a high bar. There's bad ways you can do this and good ways you can do this. Let's take the good and think about what the bad could be. So we talk a lot in the report about the role states can play because we think states are in a particularly special place to drive better identity. The driver's license is the document that is the most commonly used document today to prove identity. 87% of American adults have one. Well, that still raises the question, but what about the 13%? And it's also thanks to the Real ID Act, whether you love it or hate it, there is now a robust federal standard that's in place that requires a pretty rigorous in-person identity proofing process. So if I got to go through that once, why can't I use it again and again? Now, one of the challenges in terms of getting the states to do digital is a lot of them are running off of some pretty old infrastructure. Mainframes from the 70s and 80s. That's not an actual DMV picture, but there to prove the point. And a lot of states just aren't incented on their own to invest in any DMV modernization, let alone one to support digital identity. So we started to take a look, and we talked to AMVA, American Association, Motor Vehicle Administrators, and a bunch of others. And so what would it actually take? And if we started to look at some of the DMV modernizations of the last 7 or 8 years, and extrapolate some numbers, we think there's about $2.5 or $3 billion in unaddressed funding needs for DMV modernization in the states. And the feds can't pay that all, and there's not reason that they should. But we do think that some federal assistance could help catalyze activity in state government. And so we called in our paper for a 5-year, $200 million a year grant program that would basically provide seed money to incent states to invest their own resources in modernizing DMVs to support digital ID. And the other benefit you get by providing some federal dollars is there's some strings attached. We would say that grants can only be used for systems that are actually following this NIST framework, which ensures not only a high bar for security and privacy, but if you're also using the same standards across the 50 states, you get interoperability, which we think is pretty important in terms of recognizing the economic benefits, because if I'm, say, JP Morgan Chase and doing business in 50 states, if I've got different standards for the mobile driver's licenses that every state is deploying, that's going to be an issue. We've certainly seen some concerns. I think it's Louisiana who about 1.5 years ago announced some little company in Baton Rouge who, as far as I could tell, was like a 20-person IT development shop who knew somebody in the state. And they're rolling out a mobile driver's license for the sole purpose of if you get pulled over by a Louisiana state trooper, you can hand over your unlocked smartphone to them instead of the plastic card in your wallet, which I don't think a lot of people are dying to do. So we think standards are important, there's better ways to do it. So there's a quick summary of what we focused on there. The second recommendation we had is changing the way America uses the Social Security number. And I talked about this at the beginning. Social Security numbers aren't one thing, they're two. So, I mentioned the Equifax breach spurts and proposals. Well, the Social Security number should go. Well, what aspect of it? Because the SSN is not one thing, but it's two. It's an identifier. So if I go on Google and look up Jeremy Grant, you see a few images of me and a bunch of a guy who's a 6'8" power forward now for the Denver Nuggets, who spells his name Jerami. I don't know what that's about. And then a whole bunch of other random dudes. But there's only one of all those people who is the Jeremy Grant who has my Social Security number, hopefully. And that's what the SSN is. It's an identifier. It says, look, there might be 300 Jeremy Grants on Google, but only one of them is going to have this particular SSN. And identifiers don't have to be secret. In fact, most of the time they're not. So my email address, my Twitter handle, those aren't secret, but just because you know that doesn't mean that you control them. For that, you need an authenticator to then take it over. And so, the point we make is recognize the difference between identifiers and authenticators. Where we've really gone south, I think, with the use of the SSN is actually pretending that the social security number is a secret and that we can use it as an authenticator. And I think this group understands the difference more than, say, your average Hill staffer when we first present this concept. But the point we make is, if you're going to talk about replacing the SSN or just talking about the future, are you talking about its use as an identifier, an authenticator, or both? You need to stop using the SSN as an authenticator. It's not a secret, it's worthless. If you call your bank and your bank says, for security purposes, can you tell me the last 4 of your social security number? The only logical answer in 2019 is, don't you realize that the Russians, the Chinese, about 47 well-organized criminal gangs all have that, and any 16-year-old hacker can get this for 79 cents in the dark web. So what value does that give you? I've tried that a couple times in calls, and they laugh at me and say, sir, we need that number. And I go on. So this is sort of where we're at today. It doesn't have security value, so why are we pretending that it can be used as an authenticator? But as an identifier, identifiers don't have to be secret. In fact, if you're assuming that you have a secret identifier, you're probably setting yourself up for failure because identifiers don't stay secret. And so our point was, it's not that it's so great. The SSN is our identifier that we use in different places, but any proposal that I've seen to replace it with something new, there's been all sorts of ideas of, well, we'll have a new number, we'll match it back to the old one, and I'm like, yeah, that won't cause any problems. Or we'll tie it to some cryptographically revocable doohickey. And I'm thinking, yeah, you don't know how to do that, and you certainly aren't going to be able to get my dad or my wife or my neighbor to understand how to manage that. Anything you're talking about is going to cost billions of dollars, create confusion for millions of Americans, and not really deliver any new security benefit at the end of the day. In that, look, if you have a new identifier, everybody's got to map back to the old one. Lots of chaos in mapping and matching. If you think Y2K was fun, this would be a real treat. So, instead, let's just try to accept the fact that this is the identifier that we're stuck with. Churchill, who said of democracy, it's the worst form of government except for all of the others. So it is with the SSN and the identifier. There's a lot of worse ways we could do things relative to what we have today. We do think it would make sense to try and reduce where the SSN is used because we think it's overused as an identifier. And a lot of the companies I'm working with are actually launching initiatives internally. Aetna, we talk about in our paper how they're spending 6 years, $60 million to basically, before the SSN just identified you across everything in Aetna. Now you get an Aetna-specific identifier. They'll only use the SSN for a couple things where they really need to, as required by law. So, we think, an executive order legislation that would ban agencies from using the SSN as an authenticator makes sense. We think it makes sense to actually have a task force review a lot of laws that are out there that require use of the SSN, because it turns out the reason a lot of times when you see that there was a breach that happened and your SSN was disclosed and you go, why did they have my SSN? Because the government told them they had to do it. And sometimes there were good reasons for that and sometimes it was probably not. And we think it's important to acknowledge that the Social Security Administration plays a role in the identity ecosystem. The answer for years when people try to talk to SSA is, oh, no, that's not our business. We just administer benefits people will pay for. That's our business here. Well, okay, that's your primary mission, but you're issuing this number and it plays a role of great importance in the country. We just take a step back and acknowledge the role the SSA plays, and then we can talk about what that role should be and what we should do with it and whatnot. But arguing that they don't have a role, which has been sort of the default response from years from both SSA and a lot of policymakers on the Hill, isn't really helping the debate advance. It doesn't help us actually think about what our constructive approaches or solutions. The third thing we talk about is if you can't be using the Social Security number for authenticating, and we know the passwords are garbage, how do we start to promote and prioritize the use of strong authentication? And here, we actually aren't calling for government to do a ton, in that we think the market's actually making some pretty good progress here. In fact, in part because agencies like NIST are showing up, working in standards bodies like FIDO Alliance with industry to come up with something better. So, you guys all know you're in this space. It's 81% of hacking-related breaches are leveraging weak or stolen passwords, or you're seeing passwords be used. I don't want to get into it now. There's a whole bunch of ways you can use passwords to do bad things in systems. And so this tends to provide the attack vector that's most often used. And in fact, the problem's been getting worse. So we're seeing an increase in phishing attacks year over year, and it's not a small one. We had Alex Weiner from Microsoft come out to talk at our big event we did at our offices last month as part of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. It really drove home how bad the password problem is and how much more attackers are relying on it. So he pointed out 2 years ago, Microsoft was detecting and warding off about 10 million attacks a day. And that's a lot. I mean, they manage, I think, 18 billion identities in Azure. because people have multiple email addresses and everything, or 18 million logins a day. There's a lot that they manage. So they're detecting about 10 million, which is a lot of attacks, but manageable. A year ago, they saw that number went up 10 times to 100 million attacks a day. 2019, they're now seeing 300 million attempt account compromises at Microsoft each day. That's up 300%, right, in just 2 years. So 30 times increase. People keep going here because it's easier and easier to automate identity-based attacks that try to, whether it's credential stuffing, which you're seeing, most of, or spear phishing attacks. There's just a lot of ways that you can try and get through a system and do an account takeover and then do all sorts of other nasty things. And so what we're seeing now is attackers are basically not just doubling or tripling down on this, they're, actually looked this up recently, what do you call it 30 times? It was like quintuple or something like that. It was a silly word that nobody would ever use, but there's a word for it, so I'm not going to break it out tonight. So this is not really good. And the problem is going beyond passwords. So I was really excited back in 2011 when we launched the NSTIC program. I started talking to Google, and Google rolled out Google Authenticator. It was the first time, it was a free app you could download for your phone, and it generated a one-time password. And we were really excited in 2011 about one-time passwords, because if we could just get people to use them as a second factor, we could start to get around that password problem. And we promoted it for a few years, and this was a good model. We got to point to Google saying, hey, others should use this app. It's you can add other services to it as well. So in 2015, Eric Sachs, who's actually now at Microsoft, but at the time was running identity at Google, got up at the then Cloud Identity Summit conference and said, so we thought we were doing something great back in 2011. But what we're finding now, these days, a phisher can just successfully phish for an OTP about as easily as they can a password. Because if I know that you're protecting your Gmail account with Google Authenticator, well, screen one on the spear phishing attack is, okay, give me your password. And then screen two is, oh, now can you take out that app and give us the one-time password? And even though that's only good for 30 seconds, that's still enough to phish an account. And where is Art? He's out there. That's what happened to John Podesta in 2016. As we said, sitting here at CAP, I don't know if this is well known, but people said, oh, John Podesta, how was his Gmail account not protected with two-factor? Well, it was, and they phished the second factor. All shared secrets are phishable. Any authentication that's based on shared secrets is phishable, and the attackers are finding that out and coming up with ways to automate those attacks. So the good news is the market is responding. Strong authentication is getting easier. So I mentioned before my early career with smart cards and PKI. And I remember, gosh, if it was 2003 we were going into, what was one of the first smart card systems we did? This was before HSPD 12, we went into the Treasury Department. And you'd have to issue a card, and then when you wanted to get a certificate on that card, you have to spend 2 weeks standing up an Entrust certificate authority, and that sucked. Then you have to figure out a way to get the certificate authority to talk to the card management system on the card and generate a certificate on the card. That wasn't elegant. Oh, then you want to use the card to log in. Well, there's not built-in smart card readers, so you got to plug a peripheral in. It takes up one of your ports. And if you want a fingerprint reader, that'd often be another one. This was not really easy. In fact, it was, the kind of thing that a bunch of security weenies like me thought were great and going to change the world, but it was not really something people were eager to use. So what's really interesting are all of those things. Ability to generate strong cryptographic certificates on protected hardware, biometric readers. They now ship in every device that we buy today, be it an Apple device, an Android device, or a Windows device. And these things are really interesting because they've got a couple of common elements. So they've got secure, hardware-based, isolated execution environments. That's a mouthful, but think about the secure enclave and the iPhone that drove the FBI baddie after San Bernardino attack. Trusted execution environment in Android phones, TPMs or other protected hardware, and Windows devices. They're all capable of generating and securing and applying cryptographic keys. And they also have multiple biometric sensors. It's hard to buy a device these days that doesn't have fingerprint or face. Iris is becoming more common. You've got voice, although less common than the first three. So those two things can be combined to deliver strong multi-factor authentication. Basically all the things that I used to need a smart card and a smart card reader and a CA and all these peripherals to do, basically comes baked into devices. And standards from groups like the FIDO Alliance and the W3C are basically now making this embedded in every device so that you don't have to bolt these strong authentication systems on, they're just built in. Microsoft has certified the entire Windows 10 platform as FIDO certified, so you can basically leverage an on-device biometric match plus generate a cryptographic key to log in. Android, there's more than 1 billion Android devices now certified. Anything running Android 7 or higher is FIDO certified. Apple, wait about 6 months, you'll see an announcement. It's sort of happening. How do we build this stuff in to get to post-password authentication? So our point here was not actually a ton of things government needs to do to solve this, so that's good news, but there's still things government can do to help. They can continue to partner with industry on standards development, which they've been doing in W3C and FIDO and other places. They can continue work to promote use of strong authentication. So back in 2014, Executive Order 13681 was published, which said any agency that's releasing personal information to citizens through digital applications should require the use of MFA. It's not exactly the state of affairs these days. Some agencies are doing it, some not so well. We think it's important to modernize rules and guidance in some regulated agencies that govern authentication requirements, because we still tend to see outdated guidance that talks about, hey, you should go use an OTP here. Well, if the one-time password's phishable, maybe we should push people towards something better. And we think it's important to avoid creating new rules that could inadvertently produce use of some promising technologies for risk-based authentication. So these are tools, I mentioned before, Microsoft is detecting 300 million attacks a day. They'd love it if you were using FIDO to log in, but they're basically using behavior analytics to detect most of these things and block them. And one of the concerns that we've been seeing is with new privacy rules emerging, GDPR in Europe, CCPA in California, potential federal privacy legislation, I've got a concern that privacy eats security, in that you see rules that are put in place that might actually eliminate some of these really powerful analytics tools. And so, my personal take's been, look, if you're collecting my data for marketing purposes or other things, that's one set of controls, but if you're only doing it for security and fraud prevention, and there's no crossover between the two, and there's some thick penalties if I do, that's pretty good. You don't really want to preclude the use of these tools that are helping to automate the blocking of a lot of these attacks. So that's a quick summary of the blueprint. I've been talking for about 45 minutes. Let me take 3 more minutes and just talk about some progress that we've made. So we released this blueprint last year in an event up on Capitol Hill. We had Congressman Langevin and McCall, who are the Republican and Democratic co-chair of the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus, came and said great things about it, as did Grant Schneider, who's the federal CISO and White House Senior Director on the NSC for cybersecurity. In May of this year, OMB put out a new identity policy memo, 19-17, 13 pages of updates to a whole bunch of outdated ICAM policy involving identity, credential, and access management. On page 8, they said, really embracing our top policy recommendation, agencies that are authoritative sources for attributes, like the SSN, that are utilized in identity proofing events, as selected by OMB and permissible by law, shall establish privacy-enhanced data validation APIs for public and private sector identity proofing services to consume, to provide a mechanism to improve the assurance of digital identity verification transactions based on consumer consent. A little wordy, I could have probably done it about 2 lines less, but we're really excited about this. So, OMB has basically blessed this idea and said that other agencies should be following SSA's lead. So just having an OMB policy doesn't mean you have total success, but there's a policy in place now that puts the groundwork in place for more things to happen. The Social Security Administration, I mentioned before, is sort of the first agency out of the gate on this, because Congress told them specifically to do something. In September, they announced the first 10 companies that'll be piloting their new electronic Social Security number verification service, ECBSV. This is going to be a really great tool when it comes online in June of next year. We're seeing, I've been asked to testify in front of Congress 3 times since we started this thing, which has been kind of fun and a little nerve-wracking. But we just had a hearing 2 months ago in the House Financial Services Committee on the future of identity and financial services. Bill Foster, who's the chairman of the AI Task Force in the House Financial Services Committee, has become a real fan of our policy blueprint. Actually had copies he had given to every other member who was at the hearing and has been advocating for it. He just sent a bipartisan letter to the Treasury Secretary asking him to take some actions around identity and financial services. And then I mentioned California before. Not everything's rosy. I think California's going to make things maybe not so good in terms of the California Consumer Protection Act. So about a month ago, backing up a little bit, there is a right that is in both GDPR as well as the new California law that says I can knock on the door of any company and ask that they give me whatever data they have. I have the right to access my data, change it if it's not correct, delete it, move it somewhere else. And I've been asking the question for a while, how do you do this without robust digital identity? Because if we're allowing people to make these requests to say, I'm somebody, give me this information, and then they comply, well, this is something that attackers are no doubt going to actually look to take advantage of. So There was a paper that was published in August in Black Hat this summer called GDPR, which was a European researcher and his girlfriend teamed up to write it. The researcher took the girlfriend's identity with her permission, sent 150 letters out to different companies in Europe saying, under GDPR, I have this legal right, please give me my information. Signed, 40% of the companies, without doing any additional identity verification, sent all of the data that they had on her to this guy. Companies are really scared of compliance right now. I mentioned I work in a law firm with a big privacy practice. We're surrounded by people doing GDPR and CCPA compliance. And, you know, when you're threatening big fines, people are not looking to say no. So one of the questions in California has been, well, you're creating this right, how are you supposed to do identity verification? So the California AG said, we got this. We're going to have some standards in place. We're not just going to tell you to give the information out without any identity proofing. A reasonably high degree of certainty of proving who somebody is might include matching at least 3 pieces of personal information provided by the consumer. So let's rewind back 30 slides to knowledge-based authentication and where the attackers are. There's a really big difference between proving that somebody actually exists, which you can do by, you know, I could find 3 pieces of information on Tom I could provide, versus proving you actually are that person. And this, of course, made me dig out one of my favorite flowcharts around identity proofing, the Are You Rob Base chart. So do folks know who Rob Base is? Not everybody does. So Rob Base is, well, now is what my kids would call dad rap, because now that I'm getting old, there's rap I listened to when I was young, and then there's newer stuff. So Rob Base and DJ AZ Rock did a great song in late 80s, early 90s called It Takes Two. So the opening line is Rob Base saying, I want to rock right now, I'm Rob Base and I came to get down. I'm not internationally known, but I'm known to rock the microphone. So that's 4 pieces of data, actually. California, you could ask under this law, are you Rob Base? And based on a yes-no flow chart, could come up to a conclusion as to whether you are or not the MC who is in this song. So we'll be submitting comments to the California AG next month as part. I'm actually hoping to work the flow chart, but I'm not sure if I can get away with that. So that's all I had. I know we're trying to get out here a little bit early, but I'm happy to take questions for 10 or 15 minutes.
Do you have any success stories about the Federal Bridge and sharing identities across federal agencies?
No. I think what we've done with, so as a guy who was one of the original PKI zealots back in the 90s, I think a lot of the investment we've made there is, shouldn't say no. I mean, look, what we've done with the PKI and the PIV and the CAC has been great in terms of it really is unphishable authentication. It's very strong. The fact you can get these standardized cards for $5 or $6 from a variety of vendors is really great. I just think PKI is way too complicated. I think all the things that we thought it was going to do 20, 25 years ago, if it was that easy, it would have transformed everything. And I'm not seeing a lot of agencies that are federating to say, hey, if you're coming over to Treasury from Ag, we're going to let you, log in with that card you have. A lot of them are still issuing new cards to people, or even worse, saying, no, if you don't have a PIV card, well, we'll just give you a password. Which is another thing the OMB memo did, is say, that's kind of dumb. Why don't we look at some things that are alternatives to full-blown PKI and use one of those if we can't do PKI integration instead. But I think it's just too complicated, it breaks hard, and it's not trusted as much as we thought it would have been. Depressing as that is. Yeah?
So you mentioned that OTPs are considered easy to phish now.
Yes.
What's the next step beyond that?
I think it's FIDO.
Security?
FIDO is basically lightweight PKI, so it's, either you can look at it as public key, cryptography based, but without all the infrastructure and the certificate policies and everything. It's just, hey, I'm, signing into an account, and, I generate a key that's unique to that application. Say it's my bank app. They give the public key, the private key stays here, and I unlock it with Face ID, and that can basically give you the benefit. I mean, the thing I like about it, both from a security standpoint, it's not phishable, because the private key stays on here, and there's nothing to phish. But from a user experience perspective, I think one of the problems we've had with multi-factor authentication over the years, one of the reasons we've known how important it is and yet nobody uses it, is the user experience is sucked. So people hate passwords. So if you're coming up with a user experience, it starts with, well, first you're going to enter that password, and then you're going to do something else. That's generally not a great value proposition as far as consumers are concerned. And particularly if it's, hey, we're going to give you a password, you're going to do your password, and then we're going to fish out a token and copy the number or an SMS, like you're just replacing you're adding a second password onto another password. So what I like about FIDO is it's enabling what I would call single gesture authentication, just to sort sort of thing that, as far as you know, you're just doing a simple face unlock or fingerprint unlock, but behind the scenes it's based on public key cryptography. So you're basically burying the really secure stuff so out of the way of the user that they don't have to manage it. So I'm, especially now that, I mentioned Microsoft and Google's announcements this year that it's baked in rather than bolted on, and I think as Apple comes along, the adoption rates I'm seeing from banks, and I mean, I just had lunch today, the FS ISAC's in town over at the Marriott, and had lunch with the CSO of the top 7 bank who's rolling out FIDO. Like, they're really excited about it, and they think it's gonna solve a lot of issues. Yeah.
So you've got the smartphone as a fairly ubiquitous tool that people carry with them, much less likely to lose it than, let's say, 12 years ago, as the utility of the phone and one's personal identity with it, has become stronger. So you've got the TPM, which is Trusted
Platform Module.
Trusted Platform Module in there. But you also have communications functionality that is just near field, like NFC.
Yeah.
What do you see as the methodology for marrying together TPM with the fact that at least most people have it with them, they don't tend to lose it, and you've got NFC on here?
So what I'm seeing with FIDO is there's a lot of different ways you can use it. So I just described what I think is the use case consumers will like most. But FIDO, the history started as 2 different standards that then converged in an organization. So the first was what was called U2F, Universal Second Factor, which is, you guys know what YubiKeys are. I assume most people know YubiKeys, so it's a little...
One more time.
A YubiKey. So it's, here, I'll dig mine out. Sure.
Oh, the RSA key.
No, not RSA. This is the key that's actually killing the RSA token. So this is something that works over NFC or USB. There's Bluetooth versions as well, but it's an external authenticator that basically generates public-private key pairs. So I use this to protect 3 different Gmail accounts, my GitHub account, my Facebook account, my Twitter account. Generates a different public-private key pair for every one of those accounts, and it's a universal second factor that after I enter in the password, they'll say, hey, how do we know it's you? Well, you put this in, and then it protects it. Separately, FIDO had a separate standard called UAF, Universal Authentication Framework, which was much more the, hey, I'm logging into my PayPal account on my smartphone, and they were one of the first to implement it. How do I just do it with a biometric plus a certificate? They're both based on the same public key cryptography. It's just a question of, do you have an external authenticator that you can bring between devices, or do you have one that's integrated? Well, now what you can do, thanks to NFC and Bluetooth, is, well, I can't do it with this phone, but my Android phone that I have, my work phone, you can actually use your Android phone as one of these keys. Because instead of keeping it as a separate authenticator, I can just use the trusted execution environment, the protected hardware that's in the Android phone, and bring it through NFC or Bluetooth in range of my Windows laptop. And you can use an Android device to log into a Windows device. 2 companies actually demo this together to prove the interoperability of the standards. So I think you'll see a lot of different use cases, but I think the point that you're saying is, yes, can this be a security token to get into other devices? Yes. The CSO I was talking to today from the bank said one thing they worry about is if you only have one device and you lose it or it's stolen, how do you do account recovery? So they want to be able to give people the opportunity to have 2 or 3 other devices tied to it for recovery so you can bootstrap one. So my phone